Here with political science professor Scott Huffmon to get some more insights on the trends that we're seeing and everything politics on this very momentous day. One thing that we are seeing, of course, new today, and we just talked about it top of the hour, was Kamala Harris calling Donald Trump to concede, to congratulate him. She has really reiterated the peaceful transfer of power. And what we heard from her campaign chair today, as there was a preface to maybe what her concession speech might entail at 4 o'clock when she speaks, that to look at this as the beginning and not necessarily the end. And I'm just curious your thoughts on precedent for a candidate who loses. I mean, I know I can think of one in recent memory, but over the years, coming back and maybe doing something else in political office.
Especially a Democrat, right?
Well, I mean, certainly that happens. I mean, they will often go off to the private sector. They might, bide their time doing something internationally, private sector, an interest group. And then if another Democrat wins down the road, they might be in their cabinet. Again, Donald Trump, this is the last time he can run for president. Kamala Harris, there's a good chance that she might run again. But of course, we have seen her in primaries multiple times. And Democrats have said, no, that's not who we want. I mean, she really kind of got this by default. The point that Biden dropped out of the race, it would have really seemed as illegitimate to put anybody else in that position. So I'm not sure I see her coming back to run for president again. But remember, when it comes to everyone who wants to be president, at some point they've woken up and said, I want to be the most powerful person in the world, and I think I can convince people to let me. I mean, those are not wilting flowers. So, she could go off to the private sector and off. As far as the transition of power, we are definitely going to see something different than we did last time around, I believe. I don't think that Biden and Harris are going to skip Donald Trump's inauguration. Donald Trump has just flat out said, I'm going to get some retribution at the people I feel have done me wrong. So even if they're sitting next to him on the stage, he's likely to take some snipes at him. I do not see Biden or Harris encouraging people on January 6th to come see something really wild. But I do expect there to be people who are upset about it. I mean, when we look at the possibility of violence after the election, it took two paths. The one path was Donald Trump lost. There was the fear of, will there be another January 6th or something akin to that, organized violence. On the flip side, we have to remember when liberals and Democrats hold, protests and march and things, sometimes those trip over into riots. We have seen that. That was much more unlikely. It's still very unlikely, but it is not outside the realm of possibility. But I really do expect a fairly peaceful, transfer of power, even if there's going to be a lot of nasty words flung at each other.
Yeah. Hopefully we can get away from that in this next election cycle and being a little bit more inclusive and kind, right? Let's talk about the economics part of it. We were talking about elasticities a little bit ago. Did not do well in that. But we're already seeing the impact in the markets already today. I think the Dow opened up 1,200 points because they're bracing, and they already are seeing the impacts of a new Donald Trump presidency. All the while I'm seeing globally, though, people are bracing. Explain what we're seeing at home and abroad.
Well, let's think about a couple of things about the Dow Jones Industrial Index. Yeah. Hey, first, it's only 30 stocks. We put so much of our life as if this is the end-all, be-all of economics, but it's only 30 stocks. More importantly, McDonald's wasn't on there to begin with. Amazon wasn't on there to begin with. What they do is, Tesla certainly wasn't on there to begin with. What they do is a small group of people removes a stock if it loses market share and isn't doing well, and puts a new stock on there. So that literally means over time the Dow Jones cannot fail. You may have a recession and it plummet, but it will grow back because of the way it's designed. Now, most of these companies are big cap companies, large capital investment companies. Nearly all of those will do well if there's a cut in corporate taxes, which Donald Trump has promised. Now, the corporate tax rate's already around 37%, but the marginal tax rate, the tax rate they actually pay is only 18 to 16%, but any cut is going to help them. So, the stock market was already hitting record highs under Biden. It's going to continue to hit record highs. One interesting thing I saw was the bond market. The bond market, interest rates on bonds has been kind of lower because, interest rates were low. There hadn't been as much borrowing. That means people are expecting Donald Trump to put the country in debt. And you got to remember, he raised the debt. He did raise the deficit when he was in power. A lot of it from his tax cut that wasn't paid for. Democrats, Republicans have all raised the debt. The last person to have no deficit was Bill Clinton, but even he, of course, had a debt. So what this means is the bond markets say Donald Trump is going to make those tax cuts permanent. That means the American government's going to keep spending money. It's going to have a little less coming in, so it's going to have to borrow money. Well, where do they borrow money from? The bond market. So we saw bond market going up. So this is having a real impact on the economy. It's going to fluctuate until we see some of the more clear policies come out of the Trump administration. And again, we will know bits and pieces when we know who he picks for the Department of Treasury. Is it somebody who wants to be a little more bearish on tariffs or a little more bullish on tariffs? Those type of things are going to cause fluctuations in the markets. Internationally, I think there's going to be a little more skepticism. International corporations are going to be fine and maybe even happy with it. But the smaller indices around the world, we might see them jumping around with a little less predictability.
Okay.
If we could, I wanted to hone in on North Carolina and the trends we saw, because we touched on it a bit last night when some of the results were still coming in. And at one point in the evening, we did see Donald Trump, the projected winner of North Carolina's electoral votes. We had the Council of State shaping up with lots of Democrats, potentially some Republicans. Of course, now we have a bigger picture, a better picture of what that looks like. What can you say as far as what sort of forces were at play to see the results that we see today with such a split with some of these offices?
Historically, split ticket voting in North Carolina and a lot of the South has been the norm since the middle of the 20th century. And a lot of that started with, people who know their history all the way back to, the Civil War on. It was the Democratic Party that was the conservative party in the South. They were the wealthy whites, white slave owners. Well, everything changed in American politics in the 1960s, and the National Democratic Party became the party of civil rights. So African Americans started voting Democratic in the national elections. Conservative whites in the South, who did not like this as much, started not voting Democratic at the national level. So you started seeing split tickets all over the South, with Republican for president, but still nice conservative Democrats at the state level. Well, there's been a whole realignment. And we are seeing less and less of that, with all conservatives voting Republican up and down the line, all Democrats voting, Democrat up and down the line. So North Carolina was interesting this time. So I really think that it was less a trend and more, as you pointed out, certain things that were at work in this particular election. And it has to do with the candidates. I mean, I don't know if we're going to try and get out of here without mentioning Mark Robinson or not.
Well, that's what I was asking, kind of.
The question was not whether Robinson was going to win. I think everybody knew after all this stuff came out that Stein was going to win. The question was, would there be a trickle-up effect? We all know about coattails, trickle-down effects, but could there be a trickle-up? And in the end, the answer was no, because, Trump is really pretty Teflon. I mean, he's had more scandals than anybody who's ever been in public office, and, they slide right off. And that is not true for people with scandals at the lower levels. So Mark Robinson couldn't overcome them. At the superintendent of education, you have former social media thing. That was not really in question. I think it was, as you kind of were getting at, it was individual instances in these races that caused the ticket splitting, not so much a trend.
I got two questions. You have to forgive me here, guys. Project 2025 and tariffs. First, let's start with tariffs, because we were talking about the economic impact of these. And he's been talking about broad tariffs, 25% tariffs, whether it's Mexico, talking about China. I just want people to know outside who are listening in or at home, sometimes tariffs can make things pricier for Americans, right? So can you explain how the president-elect might use tariffs? Because I think that's something he did use in the first presidency. It sounds like it's something he's gravitating towards in his second presidency. What would that look like, especially when we're talking about inflation? It's the larger argument here.
In general, tariffs always make things more expensive for the consumers. The way it's offset, though, is traditionally tariffs are used, okay, you are taking advantage of us on this thing, so we are going to put a tariff on this thing we make that you need.
Gotcha.
So they're used in sort of a tit-for-tat, retaliatory manner. So what ends up costing us more for this amount of time, we actually now pay less for this other thing, and they tend to balance out. Across the board, tariffs are really going to kind of hurt our close trading partners as well as hurting our enemies. They will have greater effects on some areas than others. So a 10% across the board could end up actually almost doubling some car prices because we're talking about more parts for some cars, less parts for other cars coming in from international sources. So again, when it comes to tariffs, you're going to have some advisors going back to the norm, saying use them as a scalpel, not a chainsaw. Donald Trump is always about the negotiation. So he is definitely throwing this out as a this is my negotiating tactic to see whether or not other countries will back off. If people convince him to go through with it, then that could really have a ripple effect through our economy.
Yeah. Specific question about Project 2025. And obviously, Mr. Trump has tried to distance himself from certain parts of this, certain questions asked. But there is a large part of the document that talks about cutting federal services, particularly as it responds to government assistance to families, affordable housing. What would that look like if we're cutting FDA funding, if we're cutting certain federal agencies? I know that cuts spending and reduces our deficit in the long run, which is something that they've discussed and they really are working hard at. What can Americans expect in those type of subsidy programs? And with that investment gone, I guess what could happen? A simple question.
Well, they've talked about, Elon Musk can help cut $2 trillion off the debt. Well, there's not even that much discretionary spending at all anyway.
Okay.
So, when you talk about, okay, we cut these programs, we're going to save money. Well, if you also reduce the amount of money that's coming in, saying cut taxes for certain groups, stop taxing Social Security and taxes, then you actually are not going to be saving money because you're going to have less money coming in. Broadly about Project 2025, Trump did try and distance himself from it a little bit. However, the people that wrote it were his closest advisors and people that were in his first administration. These are the people he is going to be turning to. He just kind of thought that it might hurt him to be attached to it. So the reality is there are going to be massive changes. Now, if the ideas of Project 2025 do go through, we're going to see changes like potentially getting rid of the Department of Education. Now, when you go through the Project 2025, you can go it online and you click at the beginning of each one. Usually the introduction doesn't tell you much. Well, the Department of Education one literally says in the first sentence, we want to eliminate the Department of Education. Of course, we didn't always have one. It was only created under Carter. Department of Homeland Security, broken up. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, disbanded. Literally says all these things. So the question is, what does that mean? Also, there's a lot of there's a lot of statements in Project 2025 that when it comes to civil servants, right, the people who run the bureaucracy, the literal scientists who work, for example, for the EPA or Bureau of Land Management, of them being replaced, civil servants being replaced with political appointees, who the basis for their job is not, their expertise, but their loyalty to an ideological position. Okay. That could fundamentally change things. And the other thing Trump tried to do during his first administration, but there were people within his administration that said, don't do this, but he's going to have people that might enable him this time. He wants to move much of the bureaucracy out of Washington, D.C., move, out to the country where a lot of the quote unquote swamp dwellers, as he wouldn't want to move, right? So they literally would lose that expertise, and he doesn't want necessarily what he sees as lifelong bureaucrats, the civil servants, holding those positions. He wants people that he knows are going to back up his ideological positions no matter what. So we will see changes that are in line with some of Project 2025, no matter how much he tried to distance himself from it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean everything that's in 2025 is going to happen. But people should look at it and think, could this happen? Yes. Will it happen? Maybe not. But this is the direction that his administration is at least leaning towards.
It's an extensive document as well, 400, 500, 600 pages.
Yeah, it's sort of like 133 is where you find taking down the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay.
300 and something, getting rid of the Department of Education. You have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb.
All right.
Back to North Carolina races, I was just curious because we had this discussion when we were analyzing the results as they were coming in last night. Some races that just weren't a surprise based on how the districts were drawn and the outcomes. I was just curious if there was anything that you saw in our area or somewhere else in North Carolina that really surprised you or kind of surprised you.
Well, I think everybody in the Charlotte area was wondering what was going to happen with Trish Coffin.
That was what I was getting at.
That district was redrawn in a way that was safer for a Republican. So, when she won it originally, it was a safer Democratic seat. After she flipped, it was redrawn in a way that was safer for a Republican. The question was, again, how angry were the people that were still in the district versus the people who were really angry? How many of them were in a different district now? And so it was interesting to see. The other, of course, interesting thing was none of us knew whether or not the Republicans would retain a supermajority in both chambers. And it looks like they may have lost it just barely. I mean, they better hope nobody gets the flu because, it may just be a one seat that they don't have, that the Republicans don't have a supermajority in the House. And remember, North Carolina is a strong legislative state. Yeah. So, even having a Democratic governor can only put the brakes so much. So Republicans still hold the overwhelming amount of power in North Carolina. I mean, despite these statewide Democratic victories we've seen, it's a legislative power state.
Interesting.